della storia in piazza. Sono naturalmente, e non solo per orgoglio nazionale, particolarmente contento di vedere tanta gente per una Lexo su Shakespeare. Non ci sono molte opere scritte sul pubblico di Shakespeare. Ci sono tantissime cose su Shakespeare stesso, ma ben pochi si sono azzardati a scrivere e a cercare di scoprire chi veramente andava ad ascoltare Shakespeare quando Shakespeare c'era. E naturalmente, come sapete, stiamo commemorando il 400 anni dalla morte di Shakespeare. E sono molto contento che ci sia con noi Bettina Boecker, che insegna appunto Shakespeare all'Università di Monaco di Baviera, Munich, e che sia anche il valore di questa studiosa è tale. Il suo libro è in inglese. Ora vi immaginate, non ci sono molti libri scritti da non inglesi o comunque non originariamente di lingua inglese su qualcuno come Shakespeare. E Bettina ha scritto Imagining Shakespeare's Original Audience, immaginandosi il pubblico originario di Shakespeare. E io devo dire che neppure io non so chi veramente andava ad ascoltare e a vedere le opere di Shakespeare quando era in giro, e questo rientra molto nella struttura di questa storia in piazza di quest'anno, dove non è tanto vedere il fatto culturale per se stesso, ma tutto il meccanismo di vendita che ci sta attorno e di consumo, appunto consumi culturali, e di vedere Shakespeare anche, se oso dirlo, come una specie di imprenditore che aveva bisogno di un pubblico. Do dunque la parola a Bettina Boecker. Grazie.
Buongiorno signore e signori. It's a great pleasure to be in Genoa. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's an even greater pleasure to be able to speak about Shakespeare in this wonderful setting. The year 2016 marks the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare, with celebrations culminating only 2 weeks from now, on the 23rd of April, the putative date of the bard's birth in 1564 and his death in 1616. Few people interested in the arts, and more particularly in the drama, will have missed this fact, for the Jubilee is lavishly celebrated not only in Britain, but around the world. Shakespeare has obviously become an international cultural treasure, or, to use somewhat different terms, part of an international culture industry. Few authors have enjoyed a similar success story. My focus today is on the beginning of this success story in England around the year 1600, more particularly in the theatres of the capital, London. London then boasted, as it does now, a thriving theatre scene. Despite the Puritan city government's opposition to play acting, theatres, the red dots you can see on the sheet, existed all over London and in a variety of venues. There was a playhouse of some kind within 2 miles of nearly every Londoner. In theatres, like the Bull Inn, the Bell Savage Inn, or the Boar's Head Inn, were already looking back on a considerable tradition. The play would probably have been acted on a scaffold in the middle of the courtyard, with spectators located on the galleries surrounding it, a rudimentary form of theatre in the round. Play acting also took place in a wide variety of other places, some of them with permanent stages. At the Inns of Court, where the law students were educated, on the premises of St. Paul's Cathedral, where a famous troupe of child actors performed, and of course at court, for example at Whitehall Theatre designed by the famous architect Inigo Jones. All this would already have made London a kind of early modern theatre capital. But what really set it apart from other European cities of comparable size were buildings like the Rose, the Swan, the Hope, and Shakespeare's own Globe. Permanent theatres built specifically for the purpose of presenting live drama to a large audience. These large outdoor amphitheatres could hold up to 3,000 spectators. Their one disadvantage was their dependence on the weather, and English weather at that. From the 1590s onwards, therefore, we see London's theatre entrepreneurs investing in roofed structures like the Blackfriars, the Cockpit, or the theatre simply called the Theatre, which put an end to performances marred by rain and wind, and eventually ousted the older open-air structures. Scholars estimate that the number of Londoners who frequented the theatres on any given day was somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. However accurate these estimates may be, one thing I think is clear. There was money to be made in the theatre of early modern London. Shakespeare, therefore, needs to be thought of not only as a creative genius composing literary masterpieces as the inspiration struck him, with nothing but their aesthetic quality in mind, but also as part of a competitive and ultimately profit-oriented entertainment industry. The beginnings of Shakespeare's involvement in this industry are unknown. Recent research suggests that he may first have come to London on business trips related to the Shakespeare family's trade in wool and leather. How he then came to work in the theatre, we do not know. But what we do know is that he quickly became successful enough to arouse the envy of older, more experienced playwrights. Robert Greene, an established figure in the London theatre scene of the late 16th century, famously complained that there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only Shake scene in a country. The passage is notable not only because it is one of the earliest references to Shakespeare's involvement in the London theatre scene that we have, but also because it gives a sense of the competitiveness among theatre people. Greene uses a quotation from Henry VI, Part 3, one of the less well-known Shakespeare plays, to describe a dramatist who believes he can write as well as a university-educated playwright like himself. This dramatist is someone, or at least believes he is someone, who shakes the London theatre scene, someone who makes an impact. In business terms, this is quite simply someone who attracts customers, the theatre-goers of early modern London, the people who could make or break a playwright's reputation, and perhaps even more importantly, who could make or break him financially. These people are at the center of my talk today, for they are a crucial factor in any attempt to depict Shakespeare's position both as an author and as an entrepreneur. The theatres of Shakespeare's London were commercial establishments set up to make a profit. Now, the seeking of profit was, of course, far from unknown in early modern England, but what was unusual is that with regard to the theatres, it was comparatively unregulated. There were no guilds, charters, or statutes controlling the relations between different providers of theatrical entertainment. The playtexts themselves were subject to censorship. Every single play had to be approved by the master of the revels before public performance. But once they had passed muster, they faced what for all intents and purposes was a free market. The Swiss traveler Thomas Platter a key source for the London theatre during Shakespeare's lifetime, writes in 1599, "Thus daily at 2 in the afternoon, London has 2, sometimes 3 plays running in different places, competing with each other, and those which play best obtain most spectators." The theatres were run by companies of actors who all had, because they all needed, an aristocratic patron for reasons both of prestige and of political protection. The one Shakespeare was part of was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was in fact quite advantageous, for the Lord Chamberlain oversaw the master of the revels, the censor of play texts, whom I have just referred to. After the accession of James I in 1603, this troupe became the King's Men, which potentially came with even greater benefits. But these benefits were benefits. They came on top of a living that needed to be made independently from the patron. For their day-to-day economic survival, the companies depended upon the theatre-going London public. A performance at court or at a nobleman's mansion would provide some welcome additional income, but the companies would have been ill-advised to rely on such favors. To express this in numbers, under Queen Elizabeth I, performances at court accounted for around 5% of the actor's income, rising to around 15% under King James I. Economic survival thus clearly hinged on the common theatregoer. In an age that was only just beginning to apply the principles of market economy to cultural production, the Elizabethan theatre is, for most intents and purposes, at the avant-garde of free enterprise in this sector. As such, it was necessarily subject to market-based mechanisms, the most important of which, for our purposes today, is that the customer determines the success of the product. The basis for Shakespeare's ongoing success story was laid in his lifetimes by the people who flocked to his theatre. Now, what makes these people so interesting for the Shakespeare scholar is the obvious fact that they liked Shakespearean drama. This is a truism, of course, but its implications are profound in at least 2 different aspects. First, we can almost certainly assume that Shakespeare had a fairly good idea of what his audiences wanted and consciously produced drama that he knew would please them. This turns the Elizabethan audience into a kind of co-author for Shakespeare. Shakespearean drama, in turn, becomes explicable not only by way of what Shakespeare himself may have wanted, but also by way of what his audience may have wanted from him. Second, and this aspect is particularly pertinent to this year's theme of Storia in Piazza, Shakespeare was clearly popular. He sold. In a sense, this is a potentially irritating phenomenon for the modern observer, for we have grown accustomed, A, to thinking of Shakespeare as high culture, and B, to thinking of high culture as intrinsically not very attractive to a majority of the population, which means that if it's high culture, it will almost certainly not sell, or not sell very well. Given that most commentators consider the putative disjunction between aesthetic and intellectual value on the one hand and commercial success on the other an undesirable state of affairs, the question is whether Shakespeare was simply better at selling high culture to large audiences than today's practitioners, and or whether and to what extent early modern audiences, with their appreciation for a drama we have learned to regard as complex and difficult, were in some sense better than their modern-day counterparts. In any case, the exact nature and composition of his audience becomes an integral, if often intriguing, part of understanding Shakespeare as a cultural phenomenon. Attempting to ascertain the facts about Shakespeare's original audience, however, is in some respects a thankless endeavor. The documents authored by actual early modern theatergoers about their actual experience in the theater are few and far between, and the acting companies themselves kept no detailed statistics about their audiences. All in all, the evidence is indirect rather than direct, with all the problems in interpretation that ensue from this. There are some points regarding theatergoers in early modern London, however, about which we can be reasonably certain. These are: they were numerous, they were men as well as women, they came from all social strata, and their idea of theatre was probably a little different from ours. They were numerous. Shakespeare probably wrote his plays with several different types of spectator in mind. Many of them were performed at court before a select audience, and at least one, The Winter's Tale, was probably written at the express request of King James I. Shakespeare and his fellow actors would also have toured the provinces when playing in London was not possible, usually when the theatres were closed because of an outbreak of the plague. But Shakespeare's theatrical home base, so to say, was the Globe Theatre, one of the large open-air structures joined by the Blackfriars, his company's indoor venue, in 1609. Scholars estimate that the Globe could hold around 3,000 spectators, while the Blackfriars probably seated up to 500. Its smaller capacity, however, was more than made up for by the fact that indoor performances could be charged at higher prices and were independent of the weather. In any case, Shakespeare wrote for a remarkably large audience, particularly given that his was an age without mass media. Book publishing operated on a much smaller scale than we're used to, and in England, even though not in Italy, where they came earlier, newspapers did not exist yet. The only other form in which the spoken word would have reached a comparable number of early modern Londoners at the same time is the sermon, whose thematical scope was naturally more limited than that of the theatres. In many respects, it is not entirely inaccurate to describe the early modern stage as a precursor of the public sphere as defined by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, a place where people come together to discuss matters of public interest. Now, no one would want to claim, I think, that Shakespeare's first audiences primarily came to the theatre to engage in the kind of political discourse that Habermas describes, but the theatre, and by that I mean the physical structure as much as the institution, offered the theoretical possibility to do so, and that is in itself remarkable. It is also one more reason why the Elizabethan authorities kept a rather close eye on stage entertainment. I come to my second point. Elizabethan theatregoers were men as well as women. We know from a variety of sources that the theatres of early modern London were frequented by women as well as men. For continental travelers to Britain, like Thomas Platter, the Swissman I have already mentioned, the comparative liberty of English women, particularly their presence in public places like the inn or the theatre, was a real novelty. One can almost hear Platter raising his eyebrows when he writes that, indeed, men and women folk visit such places without scruple. What is particularly curious is that the women as well as the men, in fact, more often than they, will frequent the taverns or alehouses for enjoyment. However, the fact that women were present in public places does not mean that everyone thought that this was as it should be. The conservative gender ideology which confined women to house and hearth was far from unknown in Britain. For the theatre's most vocal enemies, the Puritans, a group of radical Protestants which was rapidly gaining political influence during Shakespeare's lifetime, the pernicious effects of the theatre, particularly on its female clientele, were a major argument in the campaign to abolish stage entertainment. In his pamphlet, The School of Abuse, one of the leading campaigners, Stephen Gosson, writes, "For this is general, that they which shew themselves openly desire to be seen. It is not your sober countenance that defendeth your credit, nor your friends which accompany your person that excuse your folly, nor your modesty at home that covereth your lightness, if you present yourselves in the open theatres. Thought is free. You can forbid no man that views you to note you, and that notice you to judge you, for entering places of suspicion." The women's offense is that they make themselves available to the male gaze, or put differently, that they claim a public space which Gosson thinks should be unavailable to them. That the theatre permits, practically even forces them to do so, is what makes it so dangerous from Gosson's point of view. From the perspective of a 21st century observer, by contrast, it can make the early modern theatre particularly attractive. It emerges as a kind of egalitarian stronghold in an otherwise deeply unegalitarian world. From this modern vantage point, it can appear particularly apt that the district of London where many of the theatres were located, Bankside, is sometimes called the liberty of the Bankside in early modern documents. The Puritan city government had forbidden play acting within the confines of the city itself, and the acting companies had therefore migrated further to the outskirts of what was then London, many of them across the River Thames. Bankside was under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, whose views on the morality of play acting and a number of other things seem to have been much laxer than those of the London City Council. In effect, Bankside was something like an entertainment district, offering not only theatre, but also gambling, blood sports, and last but not least, prostitution. We know that prostitutes sometimes visited the theatres to find customers. When Gosson talks about the dangers of the theatre, he is therefore not necessarily talking about the dangers of the theatre only, but more generally about the dangers of being seen in less than reputable places. It is not entirely unrealistic that a respectable citizen wife who visited the Globe Theatre in order to sample the most recent Shakespearean verse might have been mistaken for a sex worker, though scholars assume that no respectable lady went alone to a playhouse. However respectable the women in the audience may have been, seemed, or failed to be, it is clear that Shakespeare must have written with women as well as men in mind. This brings me to my third point. The audience came from all social strata. The social composition of Shakespeare's original audience is one of the most hotly debated points among scholars of the early modern age in Britain. This is partly because the evidence, as I've mentioned, is so inconclusive, and partly because the implications of who actually paid for Shakespeare's drama, both in the literal and in the metaphorical sense, are so far-reaching. I will start my discussion of this point by looking at two factors which necessarily govern any hypothesis about the social composition of early modern theatre-goers: entrance fee and time of performance. The cheapest price of admission to the Globe was 1 penny. This was the price of a small loaf of bread, with more expensive seats available for those who could afford them. Given the high costs of living in London a penny is an expense which many Londoners would have thought about twice. Only the poorest of the poor, however, would have been categorically unable to attend the theatre. Time of performance is, at least theoretically, the more limiting of the two factors. Shows in the open-air theatres of Shakespeare's London, as we know from Thomas Platter, our Swiss traveller, started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This naturally raises the question, who actually had time to go to the theatre in the middle of the day? Some scholars have argued that those who did have time can't have had regular work to do. The assumption then is that those who flocked to the Globe, Shakespeare's theatre, the outdoor theatre, were either students, that is, law students at the Inns of Court, whose presence at the theatres is in fact well testified, or wealthy aristocrats who did not need to work, with perhaps a small number of unruly apprentices who were playing truant with their masters for an afternoon of entertainment. There are, however, altogether too many early modern references to the presence of spectators from other social strata in the theatres to make this hypothesis tenable. Professor Andrew Gurr, the leading authority on the early modern stage in England, hypothesizes that citizens, what we might call the middle classes, although we don't as yet have a middle class at this point in time, that citizens may actually have posed the majority in the theatres of Shakespeare's London. What also needs to be taken into account is that London, at any given point in time, would have housed a comparatively large number of unemployed, as well as people from professions with intrinsically irregular working hours, if you want to call it that, notably soldiers and sailors. Notwithstanding the fact that performance time theoretically could have produced a socially exclusive audience, there is now broad scholarly consensus that it did not, and that Shakespeare, in all probability, wrote for a socially mixed clientele. This is not to say that Shakespeare's Globe was a kind of classless society in miniature. Quite to the contrary. I have already mentioned that the entrance fee was 1 penny. This 1 penny bought access to the yard, the ground floor of the theatre, where spectators stood for the entire duration of the performance and where they enjoyed a limited view of the stage only, at least most of them. A further penny, however, bought access to the galleries, where seating was available and with somewhat better sidelines. If you had a third penny to spare, you could even sit on a cushion. The most expensive places were those in the so-called Lord's Room, which cost between half a shilling and a shilling, that is, between 6 and 12 times as much as did entrance to the yard. In a similar category were stools placed directly on the stage, that is, in the middle of the theatrical action. There, gentlemen so disposed could present themselves to the gaze of a hopefully admiring audience. By offering both standing room and various types of seating, and of course by featuring something like a Lord's Room in the first place, the Elizabethan theatre to a certain extent replicates the social hierarchies of its time and place. For the later-born scholar, the fact that Shakespeare's original audience came from all walks of life has raised a number of questions, 2 of which have proved particularly pressing. What did they understand? And related to that, what did Shakespeare think of them? To illustrate the issues underlying these questions, I'm going to use some passages from Hamlet, arguably Shakespeare's most famous play. The following soliloquy is surely one of the most famous passages in the entire Shakespeare canon. I'm somewhat nervous about reading this out aloud. It's my one chance. To be or not to be, that is the question. whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say, we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep. To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his caetus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, and makes us, got confused there, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spawns that patient merit of the unworthy take, when he himself might his caetus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn away and lose the name of action. Hamlet's speech is beautiful, it is touching, it is great art. Without wanting to sound cynical or irreverent, I'd like to suggest that this effect is at least partly due to the fact that we do not entirely understand it. Not because we are not native speakers of English, or most of us are not native speakers of English, let alone of early modern English, but quite simply because the passage, its wording, and especially its syntax, as I'm sure you noticed and I noticed, is difficult. Most of us will probably have to hear or read it several times, and preferably with a commentary, in order to get its full word-by-word meaning. Now, when Shakespeare wrote this complex soliloquy into a play meant to be performed in front of an average of perhaps 2,000 people from all walks of life, many of them standing rather than sitting, what was he thinking? What did he expect? Could he assume that they, all of them, would fully understand the passage? If so, the Elizabethan audience must be thought of as in some way superior to us modern theatre goers, as somehow more apt for Shakespeare's art. Indeed, theirs was certainly a less visual culture than today's, and given the importance of the spoken as opposed to the printed word, their listening skills were probably far superior to ours. In fact, when they visited the theatres, Elizabethans called this going to hear rather than going to see a play. So did Shakespeare assume that all of his audience would have no problem understanding a soliloquy the caliber of To Be or Not to Be? Hamlet, the play, itself gives us reason to doubt this. In the second act of the play, a group of traveling actors comes to Helsingør, the seat of the Danish kings, where the play is set. It turns out that Prince Hamlet has quite a lot of experience with the theater, for he has rather specific instructions for the players as to how best to perform their piece. Specifically, he remarks, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town crier had spoke my lines. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hand, thus, but use all gently. For in the very torrent, tempest, and as I might say, the whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwick-pated fellow tear a passion to tatters, to very rags, to split the ears of the groundlings, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and nows. I would have such a fellow whipped for overdoing termatant. It out Herod's Herod, pray you, avoid it. The ears of the groundlings, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. They don't understand anything. The groundlings are those in the yard, having paid for a standing room only, and Hamlet certainly doesn't think too highly of them. Over the centuries, many scholars have argued that Hamlet is a mouthpiece for Shakespeare here, and that Shakespeare himself can't have thought too highly of the groundlings either, a term he coined, by the way. The assumption behind this is that those who paid the lowest entrance fee were of low social status and had a low degree of education. This equation, which is of course far from self-evident, has proved extremely useful for Shakespeare scholars over the centuries, for it has permitted them to blame any part of the plays which for some reason they perceived as offensive on the supposed requirements of the groundlings, lower-class ruffians with no taste or morals. Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet is a good example. There, we encounter two grave diggers preparing the burial of Ophelia. The witty banter between them and Prince Hamlet, their irreverence towards topics like suicide and religion, as well as their throwing around of old bones and skulls, offended the sensibilities, particularly of 19th century commentators. They did not, however, want to blame Shakespeare, by this time already ensconced in a kind of literary sainthood, for what they perceived as obvious shortcomings on his part. So, what to do? The solution was to claim that these passages were concessions to the Elizabethan audience, particularly to the groundlings. The famous critic A.C. Bradley, for example, writes, "Shakespeare knew clearly what he was doing, did it deliberately, and when he gave the audience poor stuff, would not seriously have defended himself." This, of course, implies that the real Shakespeare, the one we encounter in the rest of the text, was writing for the non-groundlings, the socially elevated spectators in the more expensive seats. And this, in turn, has implications for the present of the respective critic. By claiming that Shakespeare wrote for the elites of early modern London, a critic can implicitly claim that Shakespeare now, in the 19th, 20th, or 21st century, also belongs to the elite. Conversely, by claiming that he originally wrote for a mixed or even lower class audience, Shakespeare can be presented as belonging to everyone, or even particularly to those at the lower end of the social spectrum. We will, of course, never know which subgroups of his large and in all probability very heterogeneous audience Shakespeare preferred, whom he really wrote for. His plays contain both positive and negative statements on those who frequented the theaters, and even those statements are made by characters in a play and not by Shakespeare himself. What is notable is that his plays consistently feature passages that appeal to the intellect alongside, sometimes even immediately preceding or following, moments of clownery and pure farce, prolonged sword fights, or song. Shakespearean drama satisfies a broad range of demands that an audience might bring to a play. This in itself is testimony to the fact that the dramatist must have had a diverse rather than a homogeneous audience in mind, and it shows us his skill as a businessman. Shakespeare not only created layered and complex works of art, he also optimized his product, if you will, so it would appeal to the largest possible number of customers. His supreme competence in doing so is surely one of the most important reasons for his continuing popularity. In a way, of course, this ongoing acclaim, this literary career spanning over 400 years, is the most astonishing phenomenon, not only for its sheer duration and geographical scope, but also and especially because the theater for which Shakespeare wrote was so different from the one that we know. This brings me to the fourth and last item on my list of things we know for sure about the Elizabethan audience, and that is that their idea of theater must have been very different from ours. Again, and you've probably come to expect this by now, we have very few sources on what actual Elizabethan theatergoers thought about the theater as such, and on which kinds of behavior there were considered acceptable and which were not. Much of what we think Shakespeare's original audience did at the theater is pure speculation, based on what we know about the physical structure, particularly of the open-air theaters. When I talk about Elizabethan theater conventions in what remains of my talk, it is these open-air theaters I refer to, for they are the ones who have drawn the lion's share of scholarly interest and also inspired the popular imagination. I have already mentioned that Elizabethans went to hear rather than to see a play. This privileging of the oral over the visual is reflected, in fact, probably partly conditioned by the physical shape of the theater itself. Shakespeare's company acted on a mostly bare, apron stage. This means that there were no props, or at least only very few of them. Also, the stage was surrounded on three sides, rather than having an audience sit directly in front of it, as is the case with the picture frame stage that we know. This means that sidelines were far more impeded than is usually the case with our modern theaters, and that even if they weren't, there was far less to see in terms of a pictorial background than we might expect now. When Shakespeare, in Henry V, tells his audience to work their thoughts, he is, among other things, asking them to imagine things that can't be shown. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth, for 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping over times. Note that the same author who makes his Hamlet deprecate the groundlings credits the theater audience with quite remarkable imaginative and intellectual capacities here. In any case, for our highly visual culture, this comparative dearth of visual stimuli can seem rather exotic. The sensual experience provided and the cognitive effort demanded by the Elizabethan stage are quite different from what a 21st century audience expects to get and to give at the theater. What is more, many in the audience would have heard the play standing up in the yard with not a seat inside. It is almost impossible to overestimate the difference this must have made to the theater experience as a whole and for everyone concerned. several hundreds of people on their feet are a force to be reckoned with. If sitting still is a challenge, then standing still is an even greater one. Scholars have in fact hypothesized that Shakespeare's audience at the Globe was comparable to today's live football audience, and you know what that means. A standing crowd will always be restless to some degree, and its tolerance for boredom and stasis of any kind will be low, lower in any case than that of seated spectators. We also know that there was snacking at the Globe. Contemporary commentators complain that the sound of nuts being cracked routinely disturbed the most moving of monologues, and archaeological excavations at the Globe site have indeed unearthed an abundance of nutshells. So imagine my to be or not to be with going on. Such a restless snacking and potentially also drinking audience, of course, requires special effort on the part of the actors. Otherwise, the standees might get noisy and unruly and spoil the performance for all involved. The fact that the Globe featured not a picture frame stage, but an apron stage jutting out into the yard, if anything, further increases the groundlings' holds over the performance. With virtually no physical barrier between actors and audience, it is all but impossible to keep the action on stage neatly separate from whatever action is going on among the standing audience. The general assumption is that there was a far greater degree of interaction between actors and audience than we normally see today. That people booed, shouted, and addressed the characters on stage, which in turn must have led to a much greater degree of improvisation on the part of the actors than we are used to. It is important to stress that we do not know any of this for certain, though. There is simply not enough source material on audience behavior at the Globe or any of the other open-air theaters to be certain. Yet the idea that Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience was somehow more involved, more subversive than us, and altogether less sedate and well-behaved, has proved particularly attractive to the popular imagination. All in all, so this story goes, the open-air theatres in early modern London were offering a much livelier, more accessible, and therefore somehow more democratic version of theatre than we know. And their audiences had the kind of direct, non-cerebral access to great art, Shakespeare, that we seem to have all but lost. This myth plays a prominent role in Shakespeare films like Laurence Olivier's 1944 Henry V, brief still here, and also in John Madden's 1998 Shakespeare in Love, both of which have had an enormous influence on how we tend to imagine the theatregoers of early modern London. From there, it has also dissipated into a plethora of historical novels and even popular romances. Here is a quote from Faye Kellerman's 1989, The Quality of Mercy. This is a spin-off of The Merchant of Venice. Kellerman writes, "They were pure of heart, these vulgar groundlings. They laughed, cried, cheered the hero, and booed the fiend. And if the play was wretched, the actors would know it. The nobility in the upper seats were very well-mannered, but not an honest emotion passed through their bodies, not a true passion pierced their hearts. 'Twas better to stand with the groundlings, smell their foul breath, their sweat, piss, and vomit." Once more, I want to stress that this idea of the Elizabethan audience is entirely fictitious. No one knows for sure what exactly Elizabethan audiences did at the Globe, whether the groundlings were indeed vulgar rather than the early modern version of middle class, let alone how they handled their less palatable bodily functions. What intrigues me, though, is that this collective idea of Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience, give or take a few otherwise taboo bodily fluids, has become so attractive to us, attractive enough to be regularly reenacted in the replica globe in London's Bankside, founded by the American actor Sam Wanamaker. There, audience behavior of the type described by Kellerman and many others is encouraged by the building itself, but also by the actors, who tend to play to the audience in a manner far more pronounced than in conventional picture frame stage theaters. In the 19 years since its foundation in 1997, the New Globe has become one of London's major tourist attractions, drawing around 400,000 visitors per year. Almost half of them opt for tickets to the Yard, the groundling experience, which has proved so popular that it now comes with its own T-shirt. The reason the New Globe, and with it the putative ways of behavior of Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience, have become so popular, I would like to suggest, is that the early modern theatre, as presented in London's Bankside, has come to stand for the dream of a shared culture in which great art can be afforded and enjoyed by everyone. Theatre tickets for the New Globe, as its marketing department never ceases to stress, are the cheapest in London. But this is not only, and probably not even primarily, about financial barriers. The New Globe offers the unique combination of a highly canonical artist, Shakespeare, with modes and degrees of accessibility, intervention, and participation that modern audiences tend to associate with popular culture, and popular culture only. Arguably, it is, or at least reenacts, a historical situation in which the disjunction between aesthetic and intellectual value on the one hand and commercial success on the other, which many tend to take as a given of today's cultural production, did not exist. Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience in particular has become the embodiment of a situation in which the artistic, the intellectual, and the commercially successful were not mutually exclusive, and in which the term culture industry, of course not yet in use, would not have carried any negative connotations. Whether the historical facts, what we actually know about early modern theatre goers in London, actually justify this view is to some extent an open question. What seems clear, however, is that the vision of a kind of artistic commons in which there is no distinction between high and low forms of cultural production is still compelling. That Shakespeare, 400 years after his death, can still provide this kind of shared enjoyment is surely a major explanation for his ongoing relevance. Thank you.
Bettina, grazie mille. Questa, devo dirlo io, è forse la migliore lex su Shakespeare che abbia mai sentito in vita mia e ti ringrazio profondamente. Jean-Yves Mollier, subito adesso sull'industria del libro, sempre più libri, se comincerà tra qualche minuto. Vi ringrazio.
Buongiorno a tutti, alle ore 12 nella sala dell'Archivio Storico ci sarà la conferenza sponsor Ergo Sum di Sergio Escobar e Matteo Milley. Sempre alle ore 12 in sala Liguria ci sarà la conferenza Note a margine e note di tutti, il Novecento del consumo musicale di massa, tenuta da Guido Festini.